The sand cuts into your knees as you're shoved down, stealing the strength from your legs. Heat crushes you from below, the ground burning as if it wants to swallow you whole. An iron collar crushes your throat, so tight that even breathing feels like a risk. A chain jerks at your neck, tying you to 11 other women. No space, no escape. Just bodies pressed together in shared terror. You hear them beside you. Broken breaths, quiet whimpers, the sound of people trying not to fall apart. Someone is crying so softly it feels like she's afraid of being heard. Another murmurs a prayer in a language you don't know, clinging to the last thing she has left, hoping someone, anyone, is still listening. A man steps closer, and his shadow briefly cuts off the sun. For half a second, there's relief from the heat. Then his hands clamp onto your jaw. He forces your mouth open. Fingers probe your teeth, press into your gums, shove toward the back of your throat. You gag, your body instinctively fighting back. He doesn't care. He inspects your tongue for signs of illness, pries open your eyes, yanks down your lip the way someone might examine a horse before buying it. Because that's exactly what you are now. 12 days ago, you were the daughter of a village chief in the Sahel. 12 days ago, your mother woke each morning calling your name. She's gone now. You watched her die, and you kept walking because the men holding swords made the choice brutally clear. Stop moving, and you join her. In Arabic, there's a word for what you've become: Jariya. It translates as slave girl, but that translation is far too gentle, far too clean. It softens the truth. What the word really means is that your body is now merchandise. Your future depends entirely on what a buyer decides to do with you. Your past, your family, your name, your life has been erased. The man examining you steps back and nods to another man holding a leather pouch. Coins clink as they change hands. You've just been sold for the 3rd time this month, and the place they're taking you next is somewhere historians would spend centuries trying to deny ever existed. This is the Arab slave trade. 14 million Africans. Over roughly 1,300 years. A system so efficient at destroying human lives that almost no descendants remain to tell what happened. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe. Most people know about the Atlantic slave trade. Ships crossing the ocean, iron chains, plantations in the Americas. Around 12 million Africans were transported over 400 years. That history has museums, it has monuments, it has films. Children study it in classrooms, politicians reference it in speeches. But there was another slave trade, older, longer, and by some measures, even larger. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century, shortly after the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests across North Africa. And it didn't truly end until the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially abolished slavery in 1962. Mauritania followed in 1981. These aren't ancient dates. These are years your grandparents remember. There are people alive today who were born into societies where this trade was still legal. Between 650 AD and 1900 AD, an estimated 14 to 17 million Africans were taken from their homes and transported to the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians believe the real number is even higher because records were inconsistent and countless deaths were never recorded. More people over a longer period, along trade routes that stretched across 3 continents. And yet, almost no one talks about it. Why? Because this system was designed to erase all traces of itself. And it worked. In the United States today, there are around 45 million people of African descent, living proof of what happened. Their existence keeps that history alive. Their ongoing struggle for equality ensures it isn't forgotten. But in the Middle East, after 13 centuries of importing millions of Africans, there's almost nothing left. Small communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a few thousand Afro-Arabs in Morocco, tiny remnants where millions should exist. So where did 14 million people go? The answer is the darkest part of this story. The men were castrated. This isn't speculation. It's documented in hundreds of primary sources across multiple centuries. Arab slave traders systematically castrated African males at rates estimated between 80 and 90%. The procedure took place at specific points along the trade routes. Egyptian monasteries became infamous for it. Coptic Christian monks developed techniques that slightly improved survival rates, slightly. For every man who survived castration, somewhere between 3 and 5 died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some accounts suggest the death toll was even higher. Do the math. If a trader needed 100 living eunuchs to sell at market, he might begin with 400 or 500 men. The rest died screaming in the sand. The logic was cruel but efficient. Castrated slaves couldn't reproduce. They couldn't form families. They couldn't build communities strong enough to resist. They couldn't leave descendants who might someday demand freedom. They worked, they aged, they died, and they were replaced by new captives from the next raid. Generation after generation for 1,300 years. But the women served a different purpose entirely. They were kept intact, kept fertile, preserved specifically for what their bodies could produce. And what happened to them is something historical records only hint at. Buried in euphemisms, gaps between sentences, and silences where writers of the time considered the details too improper to describe openly. This system needed a constant supply of human beings. Arab merchants weren't usually raiders themselves. They were businessmen, operating sophisticated commercial networks that spanned continents. They didn't storm villages personally. Instead, they built economic systems that encouraged Africans to capture and sell one another. Guns flowed into the continent. European firearms traded through Arab middlemen, textiles, luxury goods, salt, which was incredibly valuable in sub-Saharan regions. And in exchange for these commodities, human lives. The kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, became one of the major suppliers. The kingdom's economy gradually became dependent on one thing: yearly slave raids against neighboring peoples. Entire political systems reorganized themselves around human capture. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled the East African trade routes. The Fungi Sultanate dominated the Nile corridor. Various Tuareg groups held power over the trans-Saharan passages. Across the continent, African kingdoms went to war, not for land, not for resources, but for people. Those who survived the attacks were marched to collection points, where they were sold to Arab traders. And once the system was in motion, it fed itself endlessly. More guns made raids more successful. Successful raids produced more captives. More captives meant greater buying power. Greater buying power brought in more guns. It was a machine fueled entirely by human suffering, growing stronger with every life it destroyed. Villages were typically attacked at dawn, when resistance was weakest. Armed men surrounded settlements while people slept. The violence came fast and without warning. Anyone who fought back was killed on the spot. Men who surrendered weren't spared. They were assessed. Their age, their health, their strength. Young, strong men were separated immediately, marked for castration and sale. Older men, deemed useless by the market, were often executed where they stood. But for women, the calculations were different. Traders evaluated them using specific criteria, and age was one of the most important factors. Girls who were too young weren't worth the cost. They would require years of feeding before becoming profitable. Women who were too old had already lost much of their value. The most desirable range was roughly 13 to 25 years old. Old enough to survive the journey ahead, young enough to be exploited for decades. Physical appearance played a major role in pricing. Arab slave markets had distinct preferences, and experienced traders knew them well. Certain body types, certain facial features, different regions favored different traits. Ethiopian women in particular commanded exceptionally high prices across nearly all markets. Their features were widely considered especially desirable. They could sell for double or even triple the price of women taken from other regions. Women who fit these preferred standards were separated immediately. During transport, they received slightly better treatment, not out of mercy, never out of mercy, but because damaged merchandise brought lower prices. Protecting the investment was simply good business. Families were torn apart either at the moment of capture or at the collection points. Mothers ripped from their children. Husbands dragged away from wives. Sisters separated from brothers. Lifelong bonds severed in seconds, with no chance of reunion. European explorers and missionaries who witnessed these scenes left written accounts describing grief beyond comprehension. The screaming, the desperate clinging, the frantic attempts to hold on for just a few more moments. Those final seconds, before chains were tightened and people who had loved each other their entire lives were dragged in opposite directions, were the last they would ever share. They would never meet again. They would never know what became of one another. One missionary later wrote that the sounds haunted him for the rest of his life, that decades later, he could still hear mothers calling out for their children. No matter how far he traveled, no matter how much time passed, those screams followed him. And those screams echoed across Africa for 1,300 years. Almost no one outside the continent ever heard them. Then came the Sahara. The trans-Saharan routes weren't measured in distance, but in death. Imagine the span from New York to Denver. Now imagine walking that distance in chains, with almost no water, beneath a sun that kills. From collection points in sub-Saharan Africa, captives were forced north toward the great markets of North Africa: Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, Marrakesh. Caravans traveled distances exceeding 7,500 miles. Some individual routes stretched over 2,000 miles of desert. And for many, the journey ended long before the market ever came into view. The journey across the desert lasted 2 to 3 months under what were considered ideal conditions. But conditions in the Sahara were never ideal. It is the largest hot desert on Earth, a place designed to kill the unprotected. Daytime temperatures routinely climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand itself grew so hot it could blister skin on contact. Shade simply did not exist, sometimes for hundreds of miles. Then night arrived, and the desert transformed again. Temperatures plunged. The same landscape that roasted bodies under the sun could drop below freezing after dark. That violent swing alone claimed countless lives. Water was the most valuable commodity on the journey, and it was rationed with ruthless precision. Camels required water to survive. Camels were expensive. Camels carried the goods. Slaves were cheaper. Slaves were replaceable. So the animals drank first. Whatever remained, if anything, went to the people. Lips split until they bled. Tongues swelled. Throats burned. And with every step came the crushing awareness that there was nothing left to drink, and hundreds of miles of scorching sand still lay ahead. Food was barely sufficient. Dried dates, occasionally a bit of meat. Just enough calories to keep legs moving, never enough to sustain health over months of forced marching. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30% of enslaved people died during Saharan crossings. Some caravans lost half of their human cargo. Others arrived with losses exceeding 60%. Those who collapsed were abandoned where they fell. Stopping to bury the dead would slow the caravan. Stopping to help the dying might doom the living. The economics offered no space for mercy. People were left alive but helpless, too weak to continue, sitting in the sand as the caravan disappeared into the distance, waiting for death to come. Over time, the routes themselves became marked by bones. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, recorded what he saw. The paths were literally covered with human skeletons. In some valleys, the remains were so dense that it was nearly impossible to avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun, rib cages half buried beneath drifting sand. These were not ancient remains. They were recent additions, fresh casualties added to trails that had been claiming lives for more than 1,000 years. René Caillet described similar scenes along western routes. From a distance, valleys appeared white, not from sand, but from accumulated bones. Gustav Nachtigall wrote of traveling through regions where skulls and skeletal remains gave the ground an almost paved feeling underfoot. Hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions over 13 centuries, their remains scattered across the largest desert on Earth, silently tracing the paths that consumed them. A mute record of a trade the world chose not to see. For the women who survived, who somehow endured the heat, the cold, the thirst, and the starvation, reaching a North African port did not mean freedom. It only meant that the immediate dying had ended. Survival came with a price. Many arrived broken in ways that left no visible marks. Their bodies had survived the journey. Their spirits often had not, and their ordeal was not over. It was changing form. The slave markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions, refined over centuries into systems of terrifying efficiency. Cairo's market had operated continuously for more than 1,000 years by the time European observers began documenting it. Generation after generation of traders perfected the process, the pricing, the evaluations, the techniques. Buyers arrived from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy Arabs from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf seeking domestic servants. Even European buyers, despite official bans, found ways to participate. Markets were organized by category. Common laborers in one area, skilled workers in another, domestic servants elsewhere, and behind screens, in the most restricted sections, were the women intended for private sale. The examinations followed a strict routine. Teeth were checked first. Dental condition revealed age and overall health. Experienced buyers could estimate years of remaining usefulness by teeth alone. Skin was inspected for disease, scars, or imperfections. Hair was examined for texture and length. Then came the rest. Those paying premium prices demanded thorough inspection. The process was intimate, invasive, and carried out with the emotional distance of a butcher assessing livestock. European travelers left accounts so explicit that publishers often censored them. One British observer in the 1830s wrote, "The women are made to walk, to turn, to display themselves in ways that cannot be described in polite company. The buyers examine them as a horseman examines a mare, with identical cold calculation and a complete absence of human feeling." Prices varied according to origin, appearance, and intended use. Ordinary women sold for modest amounts. Those with favored features fetched far higher sums. Young virgins from preferred regions could command prices equal to several years' wages. The highest amounts were paid privately, through agents acting on behalf of the wealthiest households. Zanzibar became the largest slave market in the entire Indian Ocean world. At its height, as many as 50,000 enslaved people passed through the island every single year. The economy of Zanzibar didn't just include the trade in human beings, it depended on it. Everything revolved around buying, selling, and transporting people. David Livingstone witnessed this system firsthand. What he saw altered him permanently, and his testimony helped ignite British abolitionist pressure. He later wrote, "To exaggerate its evils is impossible. The subject does not admit of overstatement. The scenes I witnessed were so horrifying that I try, even now, to drive them from my memory." The market continued to operate openly until 1873, when sustained British pressure finally forced its official closure. The Sultan signed a treaty. Public auctions ended, but the trade itself did not. It simply went underground. For decades afterward, ships moved at night. Deals were conducted in hidden locations. Demand remained strong, profits remained enormous, and where demand exists, supply always finds a way. So what happened to the women after they were sold? That depended entirely on who purchased them and for what purpose. The wealthiest buyers were constructing harems. Ottoman sultans maintained harems containing hundreds of women, sometimes even thousands. The imperial harem at Topkapi Palace in Constantinople held as many as 2,000 women at various points in its history. Lesser nobles and provincial governors kept smaller harems proportional to their wealth. Even moderately prosperous merchants often owned several women for domestic labor and personal use. The harem was far more complex than the modern word suggests. It wasn't merely a space of physical access, it was a political institution. Inside its walls, women competed fiercely for favor and survival. Bearing a son to a powerful man could change everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded immense influence. As a result, women formed alliances, plotted against rivals, and maneuvered constantly. Poisoning was common. Political intrigue, as sophisticated as anything in the formal court, unfolded behind closed doors. For an African woman captured and placed into a harem, the process meant the systematic erasure of her identity. She was given a new name. Her language was forbidden. Her religion was replaced. Her past was destroyed and rewritten. She was trained how to walk, how to speak, how to serve, what behaviors were rewarded, what actions were punished. Over time, nothing remained of the person she once was. The woman her family had loved ceased to exist. In her place stood someone carefully constructed to belong to someone else. A small number of women managed to navigate this system successfully. A very rare few rose to genuine power. Kösem Sultan dominated Ottoman politics for decades. She began life as a slave girl taken from a small Greek village. Hürrem Sultan became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an almost unimaginable achievement for a former slave. But these women are remembered precisely because they were exceptions. History records their names because such outcomes were extraordinarily rare. For every Kösem, there were thousands of women who lived and died without names, used until they were no longer useful, then discarded. Women sold to less wealthy owners faced different, but no less brutal realities. Many became domestic servants with additional obligations. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised children, and they submitted whenever their owner demanded. There was no concept of consent. Refusal did not exist. Islamic law technically offered certain protections for enslaved women who bore children. A woman who gave birth to her master's child was known as Walad, mother of a child. She could no longer be sold. Her child was legally free. Upon her master's death, she was supposed to gain her freedom. But these protections depended on enforcement. In practice, reality was uneven and often ignored, and they applied only after pregnancy. Until then, she was property. Children born from these unions were legally free and often acknowledged. Some rose to prominence. Multiple sultans were sons of enslaved mothers, but those mothers remained enslaved unless explicitly freed. Any intimacy involved was forced, not chosen. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Their features blended. Their African ancestry faded. With each generation, it became less visible until it disappeared entirely. This was the final erasure, not only of individuals, but of their descendants. Not just of lives, but of any trace that those lives had ever existed. An ending designed to leave nothing behind. If you're still here, subscribe. This story isn't finished yet. The Arab slave trade didn't end with a dramatic declaration. There was no Emancipation Proclamation, no civil war fought to dismantle it, no single moment when the world stood up and said, "This ends now." Instead, it declined slowly and reluctantly, pushed from the outside rather than ended by any internal moral reckoning. British naval power began closing East African routes in the late 19th century. The Royal Navy hunted slave ships across the Indian Ocean. European colonial administrations suppressed trans-Saharan trade as they carved Africa into empires. International pressure forced formal abolitions throughout the 20th century. But the legacy of this trade isn't marked by statues or memorials. Its legacy is absence. In the Middle East today, there are virtually no descendants of the 14 million Africans taken there. The men were castrated. The women's children were absorbed into Arab populations. Their ancestry diluted generation by generation until it disappeared completely. The victims vanished so thoroughly that most people don't even know they existed. No films tell their stories. No holidays honor their suffering. No politicians speak their names. In 2020, archaeologists in Libya uncovered a mass grave, hundreds of skeletons buried together. Analysis showed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century. almost certainly enslaved people who never completed the crossing. They collapsed. They were left behind. The caravan moved on. They had no names recorded anywhere, no descendants to remember them, no one alive who knew they had ever lived. No grave markers, no memorials, no mourners. Just bones in the desert. Silent proof of a tragedy the world chose to forget. The Atlantic slave trade left 45 million descendants who keep that history alive. Their existence ensures it can never be erased. The Arab slave trade left silence. Nothing but silence. 14 million people erased so completely that we don't even know their names. The woman in the market, the one whose teeth were inspected, whose body was evaluated, whose humanity was stripped away piece by piece. We will never know what she was called before they took her name. We will never know the name her mother gave her, the name her village knew her by. She might have ended up in a Cairo harem, competing with dozens of other women for scraps of attention from a man who owned her. She might have been sent to a household in Baghdad, cooking and cleaning and submitting whenever summoned. She might have lived in a palace in Istanbul, forgotten in some corner once her youth faded. She might have borne children who never learned her language, never heard her songs, never knew her stories or where she came from. She might have died in the desert, her bones joining millions of others, marking roots civilization has tried to erase from memory. What we do know is this: she existed. She suffered. She endured things no human being ever should. And for 1,300 years, millions like her fed a machine designed to consume them completely. The Atlantic slave trade has monuments, museums, memorials, days of remembrance. This history has sand covering bones no one will ever identify. So remember her, not as a statistic, not as a number. Remember her as someone's daughter, as someone who once laughed, as someone who had a name before it was taken from her. That is the only memorial these 14 million will ever receive. Thank you for listening. These stories were almost erased, and silence lets that happen again. If this one moved you, leave a like. Subscribe so the past isn't forgotten. And tell me in the comments, which hidden history should we uncover next?